And we are back on the 0 Hour. Joining us now is Jim Dean, Chair of Democracy for America, the largest and one of the most progressive political action committees in the nation. He is a good friend of the progressive movement. They are involved in a number of great issues, and we're delighted to have him back. Jim, thanks for joining us.
RJ, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, listen, there were a couple things I really wanted to talk to you about this week and get your thoughts about. One, of course, is Ready for Warren, the movement to draft Elizabeth Warren for president. We've talked about that in the past. Now, this past week saw the launching of the campaign of Hillary Clinton. Thoughts on the first week of Secretary Clinton's campaign and where the Ready for Warren movement might go in light of that campaign?
Sure. Well, I mean, I certainly I'm glad we're getting this all off the ground now, and pleased to see Secretary Clinton really exploring, and I think genuinely interested in and talking about the issues of economic inequality, which are really going to be driving the presidential campaign in general. That said, we got a ways to go here, and I think it's very important for us to keep our field organizing going, which we very much are right now for Run Warren Run. There are a lot of issues related to both student debt and banking reform and tons of other things that need to be addressed and talked about at presidential forums and these forums in small towns across Iowa and New Hampshire. This is our opportunity to make that happen and organize around that. So we're going to continue to do that and certainly continue to make as big of an impact on these first two contests as we possibly can. And we know Senator Warren is still there. We know some others might get into the race, and I know we're pretty close to getting a decision from Senator Sanders. I certainly hope he gets in as well, but we've got to carry this voice as far as we can possibly go, and we need to have this as part of the presidential campaign on the Democratic side, or the Democratic nominee, no matter who they are, is going to lose.
Now, I want to talk to you in a minute about both that, the idea that we need the primary process to strengthen the Democratic candidate, and the specifics of at least one or two issues. But before we get to that, Jim Dean, just a question, just a little more exploration of what we're seeing so far from the one declared candidate everybody's watching right now, Hillary Clinton. I would say personally that I was slightly surprised and slightly pleasantly surprised by the fact that even though she hasn't gotten into specifics yet, is that so far Secretary Clinton seems to have been taking a progressive stance, at least in tone, both in the content and nature of her video, and her release video, and in a couple of remarks she's made about wealth inequality, CEO pay, whatever it might be, general hedge funds and taxation and so on. The general sense of running a campaign this time around that is going to, at least in style, lean more left. So two questions for you on that, Jim Dean. Number one, your thoughts about that, and number two, how this might affect the Run Warren Run effort.
Well, I think you're correct in this, RJ, and I actually expected this a little bit. What I think I'm a little bit also more surprised at is there's certainly a different character to this campaign than we've seen in the past, and I think that's a good thing. I think we've got some new folks that are around her, Secretary Clinton, not the least of which is her campaign manager, and I think that's going to stand her well. But rhetoric is rhetoric, and I think one of the reasons we are committed to this Run Warren Run campaign is to turn that into something that's more authentic, and two, has some concrete to it. That's going to give the voters and taxpayers around this country a sense that we really are going to do something about paid sick leave, which I think the Secretary Clinton could be very easily committed to, but do something also about the level of influence from big business in our political process, the fact that they control it right now. This is much more of a sticky wicket for Secretary Clinton. Look, if she can work her way through to being on our side on this thing, I think she's got a very clear pathway to the nomination nomination and winning the election. But that's something that we've got to keep doing and putting her feet to the fire on this thing, because we don't want more of the same, and none of the voters around this country, whether they're active or engaged, want the same either.
Now, there are two ways to look at this, Jim Dean. One is to say, run, Warren, run. Thank you for what you did. We think you pushed Secretary Clinton to a more progressive tone. Now let's all get behind her. Another is to say, well, continuing this, and I think I know where you're going to come out on this, but continuing this effort will drive her to more specifics and will, in fact, in the end, if she does become the nominee, will make her stronger nominee with a clear platform of policies, or will create a debate that will enlighten the American people and at least create pressure in that direction. So I'm gathering you go for the latter view on this one.
Oh, absolutely. Number one, we know in terms of Senator Warren's position that the sale does not start until the customer says no. And we very much would like to still see her run for this office. And secondly, in terms of making that possible for her and doing what we should be doing, which is setting up a field operation, which we have done in both Iowa and New Hampshire, we need to continue this if we're going to get substantive proposals, authentic rhetoric, and a party debate that clearly pushes in the direction of the American consumer and the voters who want something done about investment banking reform, who want something done again about the influence of big business. So we're very much in this for a longer haul. And you know something? I heard Howard say this once, and my brother say this at a speech he was doing in behalf of President Obama in 2012. He says, you know, we're Democrats. We believe in an open debate for the best ideas, best practices, and best people. And then there's a time when we have to come together for that election. And this being October of 2012, Howard said that time is now. Well, in this case, it's not October of 2016 yet. We got a long way to go on this, and I think the best thing that we can do to help out and to help Democrats is to keep pushing the agenda of Elizabeth Warren and keep pushing for her to get into the race.
Now, let's talk about a couple specifics on that agenda, if we might. We're talking with Jim Dean, chair of Democracy for America. Now, Elizabeth Warren gave a speech this week, a terrific speech, I thought, on continuing the unfinished work of financial reform. She gave it at the Levy Forum. And that speech it took a very clear position. We've seen a lot of Democrats in leadership positions take the position that Dodd-Frank was the needed reform for our time, and that it is done and it is ready. But we've seen a couple other things too. We saw the so-called Citigroup Amendment late last year, which rolled back an element of Dodd-Frank. And then we have Elizabeth Warren saying something I personally believe, which is that it is an excellent start, but only a start, and that more remains to be done. Now, this speech, does this represent the kind of agenda that you would hope, the DFA would hope, that the eventual presidential nominee of the Democratic Party would adopt? And should this be the element of debate in the primaries between now and 2016?
Absolutely. No question about it. And this is particularly in view of the ways that the U.S. House of Representatives and many Democrats have tried to undermine the reforms in Dodd-Frank. My congressman, Jim Himes, a nice guy, I think a very honest guy, but he has voted something like 3 or 4 times to roll back roll back the implementation of the Volcker Rule. I mean, this is just nuts. And we can't do this. The Dodd-Frank thing is just a start, and in part it's just a start because once it was put up there, Democrats, in addition to all of the Republicans, have been trying to undermine this bill. And we need to be going in a much different direction. And the fact of the matter is we all know what the values of the Democratic Party are. We all know that these are values that favor people who work for a living, that favor economic opportunity and leveling the playing field. It's time for Democrats in Congress to walk that walk. Right now, all we're getting from too many of them is talk to talk and then do whatever big business and the investment banking business want them to do. we've got to get out of this right away. Elizabeth Warren is absolutely correct. It is a start. We need to be talking about a 21st century Glass-Steagall bill, as she has put forth, with Republican co-sponsorship, I might add. And we need to be talking about more reforms, because the investment banking business right now is not only rife with corruption, but frankly, it's not really creating a lot of capital or even jobs right now. So, it's kind of sucking up a lot of air out of our capitalist system. And if you're a free enterprise person, you know that Warren and her agenda are the way to go if we're going to actually create a actual free market and entrepreneurial type of economy right now, instead of giving J.P. Morgan free reign over everything.
Well, and you raise an interesting point, Jim Dean, which is we've been talking about the presidential candidates, but we also need to be thinking about how congressional candidates and how members of Congress today behave, how they speak, what they advocate for, and so on. There's an enormous disaffection from the political process right now. A lot of people are alienated, disappointed, not interested in voting, much less in getting out there and knocking on doors on behalf of good candidates and so on. So I guess the question is, how can something like Run, Warren, Run encourage, create a climate where candidates and current members of Congress feel emboldened to speak up on these issues? Sometimes I get the sense that when I meet good progressive members of Congress, that they feel they're on their own, that they feel there's nobody on a national level who is speaking about an agenda and a set of values that they can echo and reinforce in their local races and when they're back home in their districts.
Well, there is no better time than the present, and in fact, there are a number of inflection points right now at hand. And when we think of Run, Warren, Run, and the values that it represents and the values of Elizabeth Warren, this is a great time to get incumbents back in touch with their own constituents. And there's a lot of folks that don't really get this. But if you come at them and see, if they see where Republicans are at on some of these banking reform issues, if they pay attention to where their own constituents are at on these fast-track legislation, which has just been introduced today, as you know,
right.
we may see some Democrats actually get back with their inner Democratic selves. And we may hear some belly aching from the party leadership, but they'll thank us for it in the end. And in particular, this fast-track legislation, which is nothing but a global corporate giveaway disguised as a trading agreement, which it is not, this legislation needs to be thwarted. And we're going to have a vote coming up soon in the Senate, but then we're going to have a vote coming up in the House. So we're going to have two opportunities to remind our elected officials that we're ready to primary them right now. Republican senators already know this. Rob Portman is in big trouble if he votes for this bill. And he may have been a trade representative in the past, but he is not going to get reelected to the U.S. Senate in Ohio if he supports this fast-track legislation. We are seeing Ron Wyden with terrible poll numbers if he supports this bill. We've already done some polling work in this area, and I would suspect that my own congressman, if he supports this bill, is going to have a similar numbers. And you may see some primary activity out of this. There's no language that elected officials understand better than the threat to their incumbency, and now is the time to make our voices heard. So those calls matter, and for a few minutes of time that it takes to call a congressional office, registering your opinion right now is something that they're going to pay attention to.
Well, first of all, Jim Dean, I want to say nice segue, because I did want to pivot to the trade deal, and you did it for me, so thank you for that. Secondly, I want to say you had a great quote. Yes, we did have a vote, a deal on fast track, which is basically a deal not to debate this very important trade deal in the light of day for very long, not to give the public a chance to see it, and so on, not to let people register. You said this, and I liked this a lot, so I want to repeat it here. You said there is simply no excuse for any Democrat who votes for fast track, like a vote for the Iraq War, and our current presidential candidate remembers that vote well, like a vote for the Iraq War or statements of support for the Social Security cutting Bowles-Simpson plan. A vote for fast track and the TPP will never be forgotten and will haunt members of Congress for years to come. Do you really believe that?
Oh, I absolutely do. I have lived next to a town that has been gutted by NAFTA. And I think the audience on this thing is far greater than it was. You might remember, RJ, when NAFTA was being passed, there was a lot of feeling that, well, the labor unions were against it, but, everybody else might be for it. That whole thing dynamic has changed right now. And it's changed because so many people lost their jobs out of NAFTA. It's changed because so many people lived in towns or near towns that were completely gutted by these factory closings, as Bridgeport, Connecticut was when General Electric just moved out of town and left a pile of toxic waste behind them. It's also come to the forefront because the way this process has gone, where the actual writing of this treaty has really been influenced by 600 of the top corporations in the world, and the elected officials and the governments have had very little input into this. And then the last thing on this thing is that the amount of disingenuous discussion when it comes to supporting this bill, inferring that there's a national security part of this, component of this, inferring that it actually levels the playing field when it doesn't even address currency manipulation, particularly by governments like China. None of these points in support of this thing fly, and even to somebody who's not paying very much attention to this bill. So I think there's a wider audience. I think there's a more skeptical audience to this, and I think you're looking at a vote here, which very quickly is going to turn into something that's very, very difficult for elected officials who end up supporting this bill. And if they don't see a primary like right now, you could expect them to be called out in every single debate, and you can expect party leadership to start telling everybody that we really need to get behind all of this. Well, folks, we support Democrats. And that means we support people who behave like Democrats and not just call themselves Democrats, and that's where we're at on it.
You hear sometimes from members of Congress or their staff that they're starting to really get a lot of pressure, a lot of heat to sign on to this bill, to go along with both the fast track and the trade bill itself, which, among other things, as you know, turns some of our sovereignty over to corporate heavy court type systems, extrajudicial kinds of processes. It has all sorts of problems with it. But and by the way, I'm from a town also that was devastated by NAFTA, so we know what that looks like. I guess my question for you would be how heated is this going to get, and what's it going to take to let elected officials know that there's going to be a price to pay, given the pressure that they may be feeling from the other side? And are you hearing that, too, that they're getting a lot of pressure?
Oh, well, they're certainly floating this out in the media about how much pressure they're under from the White House. But the fact of the matter is this is where our calls come in, and this is where they really matter. Because if there's one thing that a member of the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate can say to anybody is that at the end of the day, if I want to be reelected, I need votes. And if the calls are running 2-1 or 3-1 against fast-track legislation, there isn't any question that they have to do this, that they have to vote against this bill. And I can tell you that this works. I can tell you that what we saw last week in Chicago was a clear indication of this very type of thing, where all of a sudden the city council, the board of aldermen, all of those folks that have been rubber stamping Mayor Emanuel now know that Mayor Emanuel cannot get them reelected. Just by the same token, Barack Obama cannot get these senators and these people in Congress reelected right now if they go along with him. What these folks need is the votes. And we need to let them know that they're not going to get those votes unless they stand up to this bill and stand up to this corporate giveaway. And this is the time to do it. This is the time to make these calls, because that's what gives them the political cover to say no to either the president or whatever corporate lobbyist happens to be coming into their office at any given time. This is why we've got to make those calls.
So this is a time to call your representative. People can learn more about Democracy for America at democracyforamerica.com. Jim Dean, Chair of Democracy for America, as always, thanks so much for joining us.
RJ, thanks so much for having me on.
You bet. We will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.